and lots of experts who say that the claims that the Iranians were that close to a nuclear missile is absolute nonsense. And frankly, if you're saying that we should believe Netanyahu told us that he'd obliterated that program 9 months ago, which would have meant that this war was never necessary in the first place.
Welcome back, everybody. Good to have you here. So what you're about to watch is a former Israeli Defense Forces spokesperson sitting across from a seasoned British interviewer, and things get uncomfortable fast. The interviewer, Lewis, goes straight at the core of the entire military campaign, challenging whether the stated goals have actually been achieved, whether the public has been told the truth, and whether the strategy is actually working or quietly backfiring on the world stage. And I have to tell you, there is one moment in this clip where Lewis drops a question that the spokesperson simply cannot cleanly answer. You are going to want to stay all the way through because the conversation keeps building and the best exchanges happen toward the end. Also, wherever you are watching this from right now, drop it in the comments below. It genuinely surprises me every time I see how far this channel reaches, so let me know where you are tuning in from. Alright, let's get into it.
He's winning, and clearly there's been enormous military degradation of Iran, but clearly not enough, because they're still causing chaos in the region and still putting up quite the fight to both the Israelis and the Americans. And Netanyahu and Trump may say that they've achieved some sort of regime change, but that doesn't make sense, does it? Because Iran clearly still has a functioning state apparatus. And if there had been regime change in any serious way, or certainly the sort of regime change that Trump or Netanyahu would want to see, they wouldn't still be doing exactly what the Ayatollah was doing, which is firing missiles in each and every direction, rejecting US peace terms, and exercising clear control over Iran's territory and institutions. There's been no regime change. It's the same regime.
I would agree with you that, and I haven't actually heard, certainly not Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I've been following the U.S. news very carefully. I don't believe either of them has said there's been regime change. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there was an announcement over the last few hours. Please.
Trump has claimed there's been regime change.
I haven't heard those words exactly, but perhaps certainly in Israel, I'll tell you, Lewis, that in Israel it's clear to us what a regime change would mean, and I think it's also clear to the U.S. president. What you have up there right now is the son of a diabolical maniac who's invested all of his country's resources in creating a nuclear bomb, ballistic missiles, which are landing next to my home, and you still have the disciples of that same man, Ali Khamenei, in power. So the regime has not been changed. I think we're nowhere near being able to make that announcement. I think we would celebrate making it. What we are seeing is the degradation of the regime, the elimination of the regime's navy. They no longer have ballistic missile production sites. They still have ballistic missiles. We've taken out 2/3 of their launching capabilities. And we hope that they're in disarray, but we have to understand something. There are no fast food wars. Not when you have a regime that's had 40 years to dig in, that have had hundreds, $400 billion a year of Chinese funding.
Trump said it was nearly over. Trump said it was nearly over 3 weeks ago.
Again, President Trump is a master negotiator. What I've seen is absolute disruption. I've seen him saying it's nearly over. We're close to a deal, and at the same time, in the same breath, give an order to 10,000 additional Marines to come in the Middle East. So I think that President Trump
make him look absurd. That makes him look absurd. Doesn't make him look like a master negotiator. It just looks absurd. Looks ridiculous.
I'm not so sure. I think that we're used to kind of diplomatic negotiations where everything's very clear. Trump has people destabilized. He did the same thing before June. He did the same thing before this most recent campaign. And when you're dealing with a terror entity, it could be that Trump is kind of creating the fog of war, saying we're close to a deal and giving them a chance, but moving Marines is the language of the Middle East. It may not be the language of England, but I think it is the language of Iran. It seems to me.
Or Major Spielman, or he could just be making it up as he goes along.
Again, history will tell everything. We'll look back one day and we'll either see President, I think what we're going to see. I'll tell you what I think we're going to see. We look back today and we look at Churchill. You're speaking to me from England, and Churchill was obviously an amazing leader. He stood alone against the odds. He had no guarantees. At the time, his own cabinet, Neville Chamberlain and Lord Halifax thought he was crazy. They were begging him to make a deal with the Nazis, and he refused to do so. And I think the same thing is today. Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Trump are leading a campaign against what most right-minded people would believe is an evil empire that wants to create destructive nuclear purposes, and there is no guarantee. But that's, I guess, what courage really is.
I'm sure many of my listeners and viewers would agree that Iran is an evil empire.
This is where the entire argument collapses, because when Lewis pointed out that Iran still has a functioning state, still controls its territory, still fires missiles, still rejects peace terms, he wasn't just making a political point, he was holding up a mirror, and what you see in that mirror is a narrative that simply does not match reality. You have to understand what the word regime change actually means. It is not just removing a few people from power, it means the system of government, the ideology, the chain of command, all of it fundamentally shifts. That is what regime change looks like. What we are seeing described here is not that. The same ideology is still running the country. The same missiles are still flying. The same orders are still being followed. Us changing the faces at the top while the entire machine keeps running is not regime change. That is just personnel management. And here is what people do not realize. Spielman actually agreed with this. He said the regime has not been changed. He said they are nowhere near making that announcement. So the spokesperson for the very military conducting these operations is telling you himself that the core goal has not been achieved. That is not a liberal talking point. That is the other side admitting it. Now, Spielman did say something worth sitting with. He said there are no fast food wars, and honestly, that line is correct. You cannot dismantle a regime that spent 40 years building underground networks, command structures, and weapons stockpiles in a matter of months. History backs this up completely. The U.S. spent nearly 2 decades in Afghanistan against a far less sophisticated force and still could not permanently reshape the power structure. So when anyone frames this conflict as nearly finished or almost won, that gap between the rhetoric and the reality on the ground should make every critical thinker stop and ask, who exactly is this messaging designed for?
Major Spielman, and I'm sure they would all agree that we would shed no tears if that regime fell. But isn't the truth that the action of your government and the American government could well now be potentially to empower that regime? Because you may have degraded their military capabilities for a while, but the truth is that they are outplaying you in the sense that they are showing the world that when push comes to shove, they have a chokehold over the world economy. This war is making them look more powerful, not less powerful.
You know, it's fascinating, Lewis, that you say that. And I think it's critically important that Iran's leverage over the world is blackmail. And they've been very careful about using it, but now they use it. You know, we have a terror country that's producing nuclear weapons, obviously doing horrible things to their people. How does it affect the average person in Israel, America, England? They can actually affect and control our gas, and they have no qualms whatsoever about blackmailing the world. And what they're counting on is that people are going to reach into their pocketbooks and say, wait a second, you know, we got to pay these guys off. But it's the same thing. Like if you pay off protection money, you know, to keep your family safe, they just come back with bigger and bigger requests. And if we let the regime survive, which is what they want, I agree with you. Imagine when they're nuclear and they threaten to close the Straits of Hormuz. We're not looking at $120 a barrel.
Your Prime Minister
We're
told
looking
us,
at something much more severe.
Major, your Prime Minister told us that you had obliterated their nuclear program 9 months ago, and now apparently actually it's back in action. So why on earth should we believe what your government says?
Well, I'll tell you, Lewis, I've got what I can tell you for sure is that we have ballistic missiles falling on us. And I can tell you, had we not taken such a blow against them in June, I really fear that instead of ballistic missiles, which create any massive explosion and could take out 100 square blocks in London, or Paris, which is the blast radius of a 1.5-ton ballistic missile, which they have, we would be looking at nuclear weapons now. I mean, had we not struck in June, you and I would be having a vastly different conversation with a nuclear Iran. So I think that June carried out an incredible step. I mean, I'm still alive to talk about it, but to unearth.
As you know, there are lots and lots of
uranium.
experts. As you know, there are lots and lots of experts who say that the claims that the Iranians were that close to a nuclear missile is absolute nonsense. And frankly, if you're saying that we should believe Netanyahu told us that he'd obliterated that program 9 months ago, which would have meant that this war was never necessary in the first place. But now here we are with the whole world economy in turmoil on the basis of what Benjamin Netanyahu says.
Again, when you give a country, as I was saying before, all this time to dig in, create a nuclear program, we have to understand Iran is a vastly massive country. You can hide 400 kilograms of uranium inside your back cupboard, inside a house. Then it doesn't take much for them to come back out again and start the program. What it did do was it prevented their centrifuges from spinning, from increasing that uranium supply, but to enrich it and put it on a warhead. We can see that they have the warheads. And so again, had we not acted in June, Lewis, and I think I even had a conversation with you, many people were saying, why are you acting in June? Can you really do it? Had we not acted, again, we would be looking to nuclear Iran. And if we don't act now, Lewis, and I understand there's no guarantee, then you're probably looking in a year or two at a nuclear Iran, and that will affect not only world shipping, it will affect the entire world.
Let's briefly talk about what's going on in Lebanon. Your government says that it's targeting Hezbollah, not civilians.
Let me be direct about something. Sending 10,000 additional troops into a region while simultaneously telling the world a deal is almost done. Those two things cannot both be true at the same time. Lewis called it out immediately, and he was right. Because in diplomatic history, when you are genuinely close to a peaceful resolution, you do not escalate military presence. You de-escalate. You create space. You signal good faith. Flooding a region with more military force while announcing peace is near is not strategy. It is contradiction. And here is what makes it worse. When Lewis said, or he could just be making it up as he goes along, Spielman had no real counter. He pivoted to a historical comparison. He brought up Churchill standing alone against impossible odds. But here is the thing. That comparison only works if the facts support it. Churchill was not simultaneously announcing victory while requesting more soldiers. Churchill was not saying the war is nearly over while the bombs were still falling on London. The situations are fundamentally different, and using that comparison actually highlights the gap rather than closing it. This is the part that blows my mind. The rhetorical move being used here is to frame all criticism of the military campaign as a failure of courage or vision, as if questioning the logic of the strategy means you secretly want the bad guys to win. That is not an argument. That is a way of shutting down legitimate scrutiny, and Lewis refused to let it work. Now, the chokehold point Lewis raised, that this conflict may actually be making the opposing regime look more powerful on the world stage, that is a geopolitical argument that deserves serious attention. When any nation demonstrates it can disrupt global energy supply and world shipping lanes, that is leverage, that is influence, and influence earned through conflict can outlast the conflict itself. Lewis was not defending the regime. He was pointing out the unintended consequences of the strategy being used against it.
So why are our entire residential areas in southern Lebanon being rendered uninhabitable? At what point does collateral damage become something else?
You know, Hezbollah, as we all know, was supposed to disarm both in 2006, according to the United Nations, 1701. The Lebanese government was ordered to disarm them. They had signed an agreement not to go south of the Litani, and they exactly went south of the Litani River, where they're within a stone's throw of Israeli communities. And they've thrown those stones. We're very lucky that they did not invade on October 8th and carry out a massively more painful attack like October 7th in Israel's northern border. And we have to understand something even more, Lewis, that Hezbollah, we know Hezbollah and Iran are really one and the same. It's really having Iran in your northern border. Israel's most basic
But those civilians aren't part of the Iranian
We'll talk about, I'll get there. I'm explaining our motivation. That the Iranian regime has created Hezbollah on Israel's northern border, and not only have they terrorized Israel, the people to lose on this are the regular Lebanese citizens, and you can listen to them speak. They say, we have no beef with Israel. As a matter of fact, between 1948 and 1960,
and why are you bombing them out of their homes?
There were just one moment, between 1940 and 1960, before Hezbollah, Israel and Lebanon had not a friendly, but an understanding relationship in which a total of 16 people were killed in 20 years. Once Hezbollah entered the picture, Lebanese civilians, more than 6,000 were killed. I mean, their lives have been taken over. The problem is, as you and I both know, Hezbollah doesn't wear uniforms and operate separate from the civilians. They use their homes. I've been inside the homes. Every home in southern Lebanon, the Shiite homes, are controlled command centers. They hold weapons supplies. They have tunnels going underneath them, which I've been in. You can see it all online. And so therefore, if you want to destroy Hezbollah, unfortunately, you have to destroy their infrastructure and push them north of Litani.
But as you know, under international humanitarian law, attacks must be proportionate. How are you calculating proportionality when strikes are hitting densely populated areas and displacing tens of thousands of civilians?
Well, you know what the alternative would be, Lewis? The alternative would be for most armies in the world to strike Hezbollah with those civilians there, and God forbid, having tens of thousands of
You're
civilians.
saying there's
because-
no alternative
because
to how
that
Israel is conducting
I mean,
itself in southern Lebanon
listen,
right now.
it would be
that or
brilliant.
bust.
Well, I'll tell you something, Lewis. We don't forget, under President Biden, Israel pulled out of Lebanon in November of 2024. And what were we promised? We were promised at the time that the Lebanese army was going to disarm Lebanon, and that France, the UK, and UNIFIL were going to make sure that there was no Hezbollah. What do we see? Just a few weeks ago, Israel didn't attack Hezbollah. Hezbollah launched 6 ballistic rockets into Israel, which means all they're doing is getting bigger and bigger. And I think we've learned our lesson. We cannot allow a terror regime to continue uninterrupted on our border where it could kill our citizens. Our first responsibility is to Israelis. And yes, we've asked these Lebanese civilians to leave the area because we want to kill Hezbollah. I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but for 20 years, Hezbollah buried into your homes, and we can't allow that threat to stay there. I don't think you would either.
This moment right here is what the entire conversation was building toward, because when Lewis asked why anyone should believe what the government says after being told the nuclear program was completely destroyed, and then watching it come back, that is not a hostile question. That is the only reasonable question left to ask. Here is what makes this so significant. In international affairs, credibility is everything. When a government makes a public declaration that a threat has been eliminated, and then that same threat reemerges, the burden of proof for every future claim becomes much higher. That is not bias, that is logic. If I tell you the leak in your roof is fixed and 6 months later your ceiling is wet again, you are not wrong to question my next repair estimate. To Lewis put it plainly, if the program was already obliterated 9 months ago, then what exactly justified the full escalation that followed? That question does not have a clean answer in this conversation. Spielman shifted to talking about uranium that can be hidden in a cupboard, centrifuges being stopped, warheads still existing. Those are real technical points, but they are also a completely different claim than what was originally declared to the public. And that gap between what leaders announce and what is actually true on the ground is exactly what erodes public trust over time, not just in one government. In the entire framework of how these conflicts get explained to ordinary people who are watching their fuel prices rise, watching global markets react, watching the news cycle spin faster than facts can keep up. The Lebanon segment at the end of this clip adds another layer entirely. Lewis asked a direct question about proportionality under international humanitarian law, and that question was never fully answered. It was redirected, and sometimes the redirect tells you more than the answer would have, so what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.